let's start the recording. In exciting news, I should have review questions for the final posted. If I'm a really good person, I'll do it tonight. And our final is going to be December 16th. That's Thursday. And it'll be some kind of exciting online experience, but it'll be a mix of, short answer and if not multiple choice, then very short answer. So you might think of some of the short answers as essays. I think of them as short answers because it's like 3 or 4 sentences. Cool. So now we're kind of getting to some of the good parts. Cultural evolution in humans. The 106 lab final is the same as it always is, right? I mean, it's kind of, learn the dissections and be familiar with the slides and all those things. But no one's had an in-person exam for a couple years, so I think that's adding to the fear. So one of the big take-homes of this course and of the Henrik book and Richardson and Boyd is that humans really are different in some ways from non-human animals. And it's really interesting. Sometimes people like to stress the differences between humans and animals. Other times people like to stress the similarities that we share with all animals. And there are lots. Hox genes, lots of physiology and metabolism. And Henrik makes, made the interesting point early in his book, how we think of humans as just being smarter. And in many ways, at least early in development, we're not. But what we are is much more imitative. We learn a lot more culturally, rather than, that is, by imitation, by conformity bias, by prestige bias, then, non-human primates, even those that might do as well in simple math at age, 2 or 3, or in sort of self-learning. So what do we mean by humans are ultra social? It means that we cooperate with strangers, with non-relatives in large groups, on a very large scale. And so some of the ways in which we cooperate with non-relatives in huge groups, that's what's different between human sociality and non-human animal sociality. We vote, so that's nations of, cities of tens, hundreds of thousands, or millions, or states or nations of many millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, will take time out of their day, sometimes lose salary, in order to vote. We pay taxes, and the sort of, by definition, taxes are supposed to help the group as a whole, at a cost to individuals. We join unions, which involves, union dues, and at some points, sometimes loss of income, sometimes risk of bodily harm. In the past, we volunteer for military service. So remember, another sort of really basic take home of, this lecture is that when we're talking about altruistic or helpful behavior, that doesn't mean like kind or nonviolent behavior, right? So altruism, doing something at a cost to yourself, at a benefit for others, could be, going out and signing up and killing people and blowing up towns and stuff in other groups, because presumably it benefits your group. So there are many, many examples of altruism in terms of military service. So World War One, it starts in August 1914, and long before there's a draft, 750,000 volunteers sign up for the army. And this is actually interesting because World War One doesn't start as an existential threat to the United States, right? We never. This is sorry. The 750,000 volunteers is in Europe, not in the United States. Joined in the first 2 months. Draft is not used until 1916. World War One is an incredibly costly war in terms of human life. 8.5 million soldiers and civilians are killed. 1/6 of every soldier in France is killed, half are wounded. Um, right. So altruism, um, evolutionary altruism has to have a real benefit for a group. But psychological altruism, um, the benefit can be, real, or I won't say imaginary, but like created by, sort of human preferences as well, right? Um, but it's definitely a sacrifice, whether you can argue about whether the benefits um, are real or not. Um, it also kind of depends on what your group's goals are. But mortality was incredibly high in World War One. That's because primarily because of technology. There were, trench warfare. Um, Rifles were pretty accurate. Long range artillery was sort of devastatingly accurate. Um, and and then it became incredibly hard to make any forward progress. In other words, it was easy to defend positions and not advance. So World War One stretched on for years. Interestingly, some of that was already happening in the Civil War in the United States and the Crimean War, but European generals just figured that American generals were dumb and so failed to learn some of those lessons. And World War One kind of burbled along until airplanes became more significant and tanks were invented, which could take care of trenches. Anyway, incredible losses. There are many examples of suicidal attacks, suicide bombings, and that's not a new thing. So remember that World War One started with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and then the compounding treaties that bound countries to sort of join into the conflict that started, and the assassin killed himself then. So suicidal attacks, not a new invention, definitely done at a high cost to yourself. So this is really different than social and cooperative behavior in animals. So there are many examples of incredibly high levels of cooperation, self-sacrifice. Worker bee stings, kill themselves, lead to the death of that worker for the benefit of the group. But note that cooperation in non-human animals is seen either in closely related groups. So ant colonies and bee colonies are large, but they are also all full or at least half sisters, right? Um, and then there are far, far fewer examples of reciprocity, reciprocal altruism. Think vampire bats, maybe cleaner fish. Maybe a couple more examples. But those are in very small groups, like dyads, like pairs of cleaner fish, or a small group of 10, 15 unrelated female vampire bats. Um, so that's non-human animals. Humans cooperate with non-relatives in large numbers. And the only sort of factor that could favor cooperation with non-relatives, so there's not an inclusive fitness benefit with strangers, so you're never going to be directly reciprocated um, for your altruistic act. It necessitates group selection, um, or it's a mistake, right? So that's what Dawkins and that's what the evolutionary psychologists argue. There isn't group selection, and human cooperation is just a huge mistake. Um, Richardson and Boyd and Henrik argue that it's not a mistake, it's due to group selection, which is only possible in humans because of our dependence on cultural transmission, cultural evolution. So, um, what features are needed for group selection? And the take home of this is it's the same as the features needed for evolution by natural selection in individuals, but just applied to groups. So remember your Darwin from 106. What do you need for evolution by natural selection? Throw it up in chat, or even it's a fairly small group. You can speak. Competition. So yeah, we'll call that struggle for existence. We'll phrase it like natural selection. And I'm not going to go over that evidence. Last week we talked about the extinction rates of tribes and clans, right? And so that's the evidence for struggle for existence. So that's good, and we're gonna sort of leave that here. Um, So I stuck something in there because I'm going to have it in later slides. Um, it was in the reading. Does anyone know what LPA stands for? Um, LPA stands for, I'm just going to write it up in chat, late Pleistocene appropriate. So it's sort of the rationale for studying pre-industrial cultures and civilizations. The idea that modern societies that are not industrialized might be good analogs, or have some of the same um, you know functional attributes as societies um, before you know 8,000 to 9,000 years ago. Um, okay, so variation. So that's going to be really important, and so that's something that I want to talk about. Um, Variation among groups, and we're going to be talking about that. That's one of the key links between cultural evolution and group selection. So what I want us to remember is quite a few weeks ago, um, we talked about we talked about the um, uh, Sober and Wilson Unto Others chapter, and we did that Excel spreadsheet. And one of the things we found that where the Excel spreadsheet was sort of multi-level selection, it was when you had two groups and they differed in the proportion of altruists, and each additional altruist sort of increased the total fitness of the group at a cost to themselves. Each selfish individual shared equally in that group output, and didn't experience that cost. So we saw that within groups, um, selfish individuals had higher fitness, but groups that had more altruists had higher average fitness. And what was important about that model was it was hard to make altruism last, right? If we mixed everyone up at random each generation, altruism disappears quickly. You need to have groups that are very different from each other, so that you have some groups where altruists are mostly helping each other, not being parasitized by selfish individuals. We have other groups where their selfish individuals are mostly, fighting among themselves, and not getting the benefit of being in a group with lots of altruists. And the really important, sort of take home about cultural evolution is, um, all the sort of rules in cultural evolution. Um, so conformity bias and prestige bias, and what we're going to talk about more today, um, enforcement of social norms, including punishment, homogenizes, makes groups, makes everyone in the group act more similarly inside the group, and makes each group potentially very different from each other. So everything about cultural evolution, um, makes groups different from each other. So if social behavior were just controlled by genes, individuals with genes for selfish behavior would have higher fitness, more offspring. Selfishness would spread within each group. However, cultural transmission, the way humans do it, enforcing, you know, homogeneity of behavior, similar behavior on everyone in the group, and that thereby making them potentially very different from other groups, now increases variation among groups. So all this, the way that cultural transmission works in humans keeps groups different from each other. That's the key thing about making groups separate. And so then there also has to be variation among groups. And then um, the last feature that's needed is that, um, the you know variation must, um, affect group fitness, um, average success. And that could be reproductive success, that could be military success, because the other thing about cultural evolution is that if one group defeats another, it might take over that other group and impose its culture on that group, right? So it's not necessarily that, the variation leads to differences in average numbers of babies, although that can be really important. But successful groups can actually take over other groups. Okay, so, as always, I did the next slide, the last slide. So variation among groups. Um, just remember from the previous slide that variation is cultural, I'll just say it again because it's so important. It's in the readings. Um, Transmissing. I've lost the power of words. Um, Cultural transmission um, enforces, maintains, maintains variation among groups. Variation tied to fitness, success of groups. That could be reproductive success. That could be um, it could be average reproduction, but it could also be military or economic. Economic success, if people are having trouble making a living in one country, they're going to move to another country, and the sort of size of one group has increased at a cost of another. Heritability, um, we've we've seen cultural transmission can maintain um, beliefs, technology, ideas over multiple generations. So that one's easy. Okay. Okay. So I just want to, expand on the idea that cultural evolution or cultural transmission maintains variation among groups. So we saw in the song dialect studies that um, those song dialects not controlled, not related to genetic distance or genetic variation, but rather um, it's a behavior that immigrants adopt when they enter a new dialect neighborhood in order to match local customs. And we see that in um, to varying degrees, but we see that in you know examples of human adoption, immigration, emigration studies, examples as well. Immigrants will take on the character of the majority or the most successful in the new group, and we talked about the patterns of imitation that are commonly seen include conformist bias, doing what's most commonly done, and prestige bias, imitating the behaviors of successful individuals. Um, and what we're going to talk about, more this lecture, strong reciprocity, maintains variation among groups and enforces stability of often costly traits. So this relates to a much older debate on human nature, and also sort of the nature of sort of power, political power. So Niccolo Machiavelli was the governor of a city-state, and also, but much more successful as an influential thinker than as a politician. And he's arguing kind of the same as Dawkins, that people um, are sort of rational, selfish individuals. The word in Machiavelli is knaves. Um, and so he's in this quote from the prince, he's asking whether you would rather be feared or loved. For this can be said about the generality of men, that they are ungrateful, fickle, dissembling, anxious to flee danger, and covetous of gain. So selfish, in some ways optimal, rationally, selfish individuals. Um, so long as you promote their advantage, they're all yours. So they'll only support you when it's in their interest and will offer you their blood, their goods, their lives, and their children when the need for these is remote. Um, when the need arises, however, they will turn against you. So Machiavelli is arguing that people are selfish. They'll only help when they can see, they'll promise to help when they don't actually have to. And then costly help will never be provided voluntarily. You need to make them fear you in order to, gain their service and loyalty. Um, in contrast, um, an older but not that different, well, 200 years earlier, King of France, Louis the Ninth, was quoted as, sort of giving deathbed advice to his son. I would pray that you would make yourself beloved of your people, for truly I would prefer a Scot should come from Scotland and govern the kingdom loyally, than you should govern it ill. So Louis the Ninth is arguing that you should be a just and beloved leader in order to do right by your people, which might have been hokum. Certainly, people eventually decided that they didn't need a monarchy in France, um, but um, it's interesting. So Machiavelli is read in business schools and by politicians. Is definitely a more influential thinker now. Interestingly, Louis the Ninth was an extremely successful um, king. Had a long reign. Increase in territory and wealth. Um, Machiavelli was a political failure. He wasn't able to, raise enough of an army to hold back Spanish occupying forces, and he wasn't able to become part of the local, new regime, which gave him lots of time to write. But it's interesting that, you know, if you're judging sort of empirically, his personal thinking about what motivates individuals didn't um, you know didn't actually translate into actual political success, which is fine, um, right? Those who can't do teach, or um, it's possible that Machiavelli was not right about what motivates cooperation. So, um, the rational self-interest is the same as what Machiavelli would call humans knaves. He says that all people are knaves, only out for their own selfish interests. And so it's important to sort of realize that rationally selfish interest agents can't actually form a functioning society. If everyone really is out for themselves all the time, cooperation will break down everywhere. Cars will smash into each other. No one will pay their taxes. Roads won't get built. Um, Society would really collapse. Um, and so, but it's an interesting question. Are humans self-interested knaves? Are we just being forced into cooperative behavior out of fear of punishment? And to try to answer these questions, people have done a lot of experiments on human behavior to test both altruism and especially the willingness to punish at a cost. And we're going to be talking about a bunch of those experiments this week and in the last lecture as well. Well, can't cooperation be a form of self-interested behavior? So it could be, and or maybe it's a form of self-interested behavior on a long enough time scale. But humans, like, we're not good at um, thinking on long time scales. In other words, no one wakes up in the morning and says, how are my choices today going to affect my great 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 grandchildren's health in 500 years. I skipped a bunch of grades, um, and which is fine, right? We have on average a lifespan of, it used to probably be, 40 years on average, but there were always some people living to 70 or 80 years, and some people you can see variation in among the humans that you know. Some people are really good at thinking ahead a couple years, some 10 or 20 years, some have a lot of trouble, but almost no one really wakes up every morning and guides their behavior um, to make sure that their great great grandchildren will be in good shape. You know, I feel like grandchildren is about the limit of what we usually plan on and work on. Um, okay, so we're going to look at some of these experiments to test um, both altruism and moralistic punishment. So I want us to go over some definitions of terms. Strong reciprocity is different from reciprocal altruism, as seen by as explained by Wilkinson and the vampire bats. So reciprocal altruism is the performance of helpful altruistic behavior, helps others at a cost to yourself, with the expectation of reciprocation, the reward being returned to you in the future. The expectation is that the behavior increases um, the net reward, you know, to you in your lifetime. Um, Reciprocity or moralistic punishment, strong reciprocity, is the willingness to enforce social norms. In other words, to make other people cooperate, not even necessarily with you, maybe cooperate with someone else, right? Like the willingness to punish someone who is um, not, to punish someone who's not paying their taxes in general, um, or to punish someone, you see someone uh, drive recklessly and hit another car and you stay to bear witness to the police about that person's bad behavior, right? It's not that the damage was done to you. Um, it's not that you're expecting a kind act in return later. It's um, it's an urge to punish at some potential risk for yourself. Maybe that guy has a bat in his car and will, attack you before the police arrive. Um, okay, so as always, these things first get tested with, psych students in colleges, but actually, these types of experiments have been expanded into more and more realistic scenarios. So we talked about the ultimatum game before. We're going to be talking about some fairly similar variations. This is called the public goods game. And so in the public goods game, you have a group of like 4 or 10, a small group of individuals, and they each have to contribute to a shared pool that will then be multiplied by a factor, like doubled, and then divided evenly among all the players. So groups of 4 are each given $10 in one version of this experiment. How much should each individual contribute? So let's work through this problem and let's think for a second. So how much does each individual receive if each contributes all their money, $10? So think about that for a second. Yep. If everyone contributes $10, then you'll have a group of 4. They each contribute $10. You have $40 times 2 equals $80 divided by 4. Everyone gets $20. Now, How much do you have if you contribute nothing and everyone else contributes $5? Well, if everyone else contributes $5, then there's 15 in the pool times 2 equals 30. And then that gets divided among 4 individuals by 4 equals 7.5, I think. Yeah. Um, so in that case, how much would you have if you contribute nothing? You'd have 7.5 plus 10 equals 17.5. Well, that's not great, but what does everyone else have in that case? Everyone else would have 12.5. Okay, does that make sense? 12.5 is everyone else puts in 5, so they're left with 5. And then everyone splits that 7.5, which is the pool divided by 4. So the pool divided by 4 is 7.5. Everyone's going to get that plus what they had. So if you contribute nothing and everyone else contributes $5, you'll end up with more than anyone else. If you contribute nothing and everyone else contributes $10, then that's 60 divided by 4, which is 15, plus your 10, you'd have 25. Um, so it's an interesting question. Um, the less you contribute, the less everyone gets, but the more you have relative to everyone else. Okay, so when this game is played in sort of constant groups, an interesting pattern arises, which is in the beginning, people usually contribute about half of what they um, start out with. But over time, people get a little grumpy at each other because some people are not contributing as much, and over time, cooperation erodes, and people put in less and less. So over repeated rounds, initially most contribute something, but by later rounds, 60 to 80% contribute nothing, and the rest are contributing a little. So that's kind of interesting. 20 to 30% are kind of hardcore altruists. They're contributing even though they know that there are other people in this game who are not contributing anything, but they keep contributing. So that's interesting. About a third never contribute. So there are some knaves, as Machiavelli argued everyone is. Um, and about 50% are conditional cooperators. In other words, they contribute more when others are expected to, and they contribute more when others are contributing more. Um, However, over time, this game kind of repeated playing this game, um, cooperation erodes. What can maintain cooperation in this kind of public goods situation, this public goods game? If you add a punishment option. So in this game, players were told who didn't contribute, and for every dollar spent on punishment, $3 would be taken from a non-contributor, and then divided equally. But so again, what is the rational punishment strategy? That $3 that would be taken from a non-contributor, doesn't go to anyone else. It's just punishing that non-contributor. Um, Again, let's say we played this game and how does it remind you of an episode of People's Court? Old
So
joke.
that this guy lived in this community where they did fundraisers from time to time, and
So the
one
rational
fundraiser.
punishment strategy um, is actually, well, I'm going to wait a second. What is the rational punishment strategy in this game? Okay, so if you don't punish, um, then you don't lose any dollars. If you punish, you're reducing your own um, you're reducing your own um, uh, you're you know you're doing it at a cost to yourself. So the rational punishment strategy, the let's the rational strategy as this game is constructed is not to punish because it costs you and you don't get a direct return. But what actually happens when you play this public goods game is that people are willing to punish and that adding punishment to this public goods game leads to a much higher level of contribution among everyone else, right? So if you add punishment to that public goods game, you end up enforcing a very high level of contribution. And it's interesting. It's not completely clear whether it's the punishment that people who are who are not contributing are losing money, or whether it's like the shame prestige that goes on in this because the punishment is it's hard to separate. The punishment is that that everyone is told who's not contributing, and also that for a cost you can make that person who's not contributing lose money. Um, I actually, yes, contribution in this public goods game is cooperation, but so is punishment because punishment in this game comes at a cost to whoever's doing the punishing. Um, it's actually pretty interesting. I should go back to the Farragut paper, which I have here, but I didn't reread it before this lecture, um, because it really matters. Like you could see punishment without being told who's being punished versus punishment while being told who's being punished. And yes, you have to pay to punish. You pay 1 unit, $1, and $3 is taken from someone who didn't contribute. Um, so cooperation depends on both weak and strong reciprocity. In other words, um, it depends on weak reciprocity, which is that people stop cooperating when they see other people stop not cooperating, like the system breaks down. But also, strong reciprocity is punishment at a cost to individuals. Individuals are willing to punish those who are not cooperating. Um, and then the other take home from the public goods game is that within subject groups, you find diversity of sort of innate behavioral strategies. There are some individuals who never contribute, those are knaves. You find moralistic punishers, people who are willing to spend their own money to make to punish other individuals. You have conditional cooperators who would stop contributing to this pool on their own, but if they're being sort of forced to, then they're sort of happy to contribute. Okay, another example of people acting somewhat selfishly, but also being responsive to cooperation on the part of others is an employer-employee game. Um, so in this game, and sometimes it's played out where people actually have to work and do a task, although they're arbitrarily usually assigned the role of employer and employee at the start. The employer offers a wage of something low to high, 1 to 100 for a desired effort. Um, and that effort can range from partial 0.1 to 1.0. Um, after agreeing on that offer, the employer pays the employee the wage and then receives some payment, which is going to be 100 times the effort minus the wage that was paid out. Um, so 100 times, this is not clear the way it's drawn. So I just want to point out, I'll put in a little parentheses here that'll make it more clear. So the employer gets 100 times the effort minus the wage that was paid out, and then the worker works as hard as he or she wants, and there is a cost to effort, right? So the cost is 0, 1, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 15, or 18. And so the worker is going to get, you know, wage minus the cost for a given effort. Um, so in this example, before we look at the data, what would the self-interested behaviors be for the employer and for the employee? So let's first for the employer and then for the employee. Yeah, so um, the employer should offer a very low wage, and the employee does the work after receiving the wage. So the employee should always work a minimal amount, right? So those are the sort of self-interested behaviors. Um, and in fact, and we sometimes see that dynamic playing out. But what happens in sort of controlled versions of this game? So the workers should provide minimal effort, no matter what the wage. And employers, based on that assumption that after being paid, workers are not going to work much because they're self-interested knaves, employers should only offer minimal wage. Um, but in fact, when this game gets played, um, what you see is um, the there's a range in the payoff offered to the employee. Remember, it could be it's going to be somewhere between 1 and 100, and so you don't see offers of 100, but you see offers from very low up to 50. Um, and the contracted effort is higher the higher the payoff offer. The delivered effort is less than the contracted effort, but it's not minimal. And the higher the pay, the more work provided. So again, both the workers and the employers in this game um, are not behaving completely rationally or selfishly. There are lots of offers above minimum, and the effort is not always minimal, and it's the um, proportional to the payoff, which means you have reciprocity here. Um, and in some ways, yeah, you have you have reciprocity. This isn't strong reciprocity, but this is um, an example of individuals not acting always in their rational self-interest. Um, so, however, there is some selfishness. In other words, the delivered effort is less than what's contracted, but it's still proportional, which is interesting. Um, now, you never just do one version of this experiment. Um, if you add an opportunity to reciprocate, in other words, spending um, a unit to either reduce or increase workers' wages by a significant multiple. Um, if employers play this game only once, they should never spend an additional unit to affect their workers' wages. In other words, a tip, you could think of that. But in fact, employers, um, you know, either employers are willing to punish or reward workers' wages at a cost to themselves. So 68% of the time, employers punished employees who underfulfilled. 70% of the time, employers rewarded employees who overfulfilled or met the contractual effort in this game. Um, and what was really the other sort of interesting take home is that games that were played with both sides able to punish. In other words, workers can punish in this game by working less than they agreed to, and employers can punish in this game by basically paying a fee to increase or decrease worker salaries after work had been done. When you allow both sides to reciprocate, what you end up with are higher offers of pay and um, higher fulfillment of contracts. So 40% higher payoffs for all. Okay. Um, we're now up to the ultimatum game, which we played as a class earlier in the semester. So this is the ultimatum game, is when the proposer um, divides 10 monetary units, right? And so the take home of these monetary units is, one criticism of these experiments is that maybe the stakes are too low. So we'll see later on that the stakes can actually have been pretty high in some of these experiments, like 3 months salary, and they behave similarly. So that's what we're going to be taking a look at. So the proposer divides 10 monetary units, not saying whether that monetary unit is $10 or $500. The responder accepts, and then the division as proposed is distributed, or rejects and no one gets anything. So we talked about the rational selfish strategy in a one trial anonymous game. Um, so just someone remind us, what's the rational selfish strategy if you're going to do this once and you don't know the person that you're dealing with, right? So no opportunities for reciprocity or punishment.
Isn't that when you take everything instead of deciding to split it?
The proposer, what should they do?
The proposer wants to take everything.
Come on. Well, here's the thing. So I would disagree. So Jason is saying the proposer should propose 10 for me and 0 for you. Now, if the proposer did that, what should the responder do? If the responder accepts, they get nothing. If they reject, they get nothing, but the proposer gets nothing. So the responder should reject. But what happens if the proposer proposes 9 for me and 1 for you? What should a rational responder do? Yeah, 1, I'm going to do the complex math. 1 is greater than 0, so accept. Right? So that's the rational strategy, is a responder should accept any non-zero offer. So the proposer should propose the most selfish non-zero offer. In this case, there's 10 units, 9 for the proposer, 1 for the responder. Exactly, 9 to 1. So Henrik performed cross-cultural trials. In other words, went to, um, played this game in 15 small-scale societies in 12 different countries, and none of them acted in that 9 to 1 ratio. However, there's a lot of variation. College student, the mean offer was 46%, which is almost exactly like, remember we were really boring? Everyone, remember we all did 50%? Right? That's what we did when we did it in the class, for a small amount of points. Small scale societies varied from 26 to 58%. So 58% is interesting, right? That is a hyper fair offer, right? So the proposer is offering more to the responder than to themselves. And interestingly, in some societies, responders would refuse hyper fair offers, right? And these are societies where prestige is is basically gained by giving people gifts. And so a hyper fair offer is basically a play for prestige and maybe the perception of debt or something. And so people would actually irrationally refuse um, offers the larger they were in some of the societies studied. So what you can see here is these are on the x-axis, we have the ultimatum game offer. The size of the circle of the dot is proportional to the percentage. And in these different groups, some would offer, no one was offering, the no one was offering the minimum. Well, some people were, but that wasn't the most common, right? So the Quichua, Machichuenga, Hadza, these were groups that were offering less than 50% most of the time. So these are, we'll say, less cooperative groups in general, but still more than rational self-interest. And there are some groups where the average is higher. So the Lamalera were one of those groups that offered more than 50% as the proposer on average. And sometimes those overly generous offers were going to be rejected by the recipients. So offers were higher in cultures which had greater payoffs to cooperation. In other words, cultures where groups of individuals regularly had to cooperate. So cultures where land was sometimes cultivated collectively um, would have higher average offers versus groups where people grazed flocks more independently and had less frequent um, need for cooperative interactions. Offers were also higher in cultures which had greater market integration. In other words, where people were frequently doing exchange or trades. So that was kind of interesting, looking at the different cultures, that the behavior in this artificial game matched some of the sort of you know culturally relevant, important read my mind practices in those societies. So these are measures of aggregate market integration. So how often people are exchanging goods and also paying each other wages for labor. And there's a positive relationship between market integration and the this is the index of payoffs to cooperation, basically. um, how often are how often do individuals benefit from cooperative behavior, primarily by working together to either protect or exploit shared resources. Um, so were these offers rational given the rate of acceptance? And so that's an interesting question. The idea is that, like, rational offers depend on knowledge of whether the other individual will accept your offer. So basically, what that's saying is people um, might well know more than just whether the other person is completely rational. In other words, if you know that someone is willing to punish, you should rationally give a higher offer, right? And so um, they 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 compared the the offers to the acceptance rate in different societies, and um, the the offers were higher than predicted by acceptance rate. So, for instance, in the Orma, um, the um, the rejection rate is on average pretty high. In other words, in the Orma, they reject um, any offer that's less than 40%. Um, and the average mean offer was higher than that. In the Machichuanga, remember that was a society with fairly low offers. That also is a society with closer to rational acceptance rate. In other words, the Machichanga people were not punishing low offers as much. Interestingly, the offers were higher than the acceptance rate, right? So what's important here is, first of all, that there's a bit of a positive correlation between what offers are accepted versus rejected, and then, um, but also, it's not a perfect correlation, and the derivatives, in other words, the distance from the point to a matching, is almost always positive, but not always. Almost always, but not always positive. Um, so when you do this, when you play Ultimatum game repeatedly and you also don't play it anonymously, um, you now have much higher um, offers, and you also have um, higher you have higher rejection rates. So when you play this game anonymously, um, then the offers are lower, and but when you play with the game with a reputational opportunity, so you can switch the game from when you play with a reputational opportunity, um, the um, the average um, the average threshold. In other words, the willingness to reject below that level is higher. Um, and then, however, when the game is played anonymously, um, people are not willing to reject. They're not willing to. They're not willing to punish at a cost to themselves. And you can do this either starting anonymously and then telling everyone how the others are behaving. So this is starting anonymously. Let's change the color. Or you can play it um, starting reputationally. And this monetary unit threshold is um, above, it's the threshold for acceptance. So when there's a reputational opportunity, how do we do this? When Okay. Or when past rejection rates are known. When the game is played anonymously, people are going to act more selfishly. They're less willing to reject an offer. So we talked about the wage game before already. This is a repeat of the earlier slide. First, you agree on a wage for a certain effort, and then the employer receives 100 times effort minus the wage cost. The employee receives the wage minus a certain cost associated with that effort. And if the wage goes from 0 to 100, the effort usually goes from like 0 to 50. And the optimum, we said, is offer a very low wage. And the employee should always give low effort no matter what the wage. That's not what happens. And then if there's punishment, it's maintained. I'm not sure why that slide was repeated, except that there's going to be a graph of that wage game when it's played with for like real stakes of wages versus low stakes. So there have been criticisms of these experiments as evidence for moralistic punishment, strong reciprocity in people. So I just want to show you, remind us that that means the same. Sometimes these things are called the same thing, moralistic, which means costly punishment. Okay, so one challenge, one valid criticism is that the stakes in these lab games can be really a lot lower than they are in real life, and the cost of punishment is often much lower in these lab experiments because in real life, the cost to like punishing someone for stealing game from an animal from someone else might be that they hate you and they get into a fight with you and injure you, or worse, try to take revenge on you in some other way, or even kill you. So the cost of punishment in these games is really low um, compared to the danger of like entering into a feud in real life between families. There's also been the argument that punishment benefits the punishers in real life in some cases, so it's not altruistic. And then the other argument is that strong reciprocity requires group selection, but Richardson and Boyd argue that's true. You do need some group selection to favor punishment, but the way we homogenize our groups with cultural transmission and cultural evolution means that we can have some group selection. It's not as vulnerable to selfish mutations. Okay, so let's talk about some of these arguments. So the arguments in general are saying that these lab experiments make punishment more a better strategy than it might be in real life because the games are too low stake. And so we're gonna talk about each of these. There's this, like in the games, the punishments might be relatively high. In other words, like 2 monetary units in a ultimatum game, but absolutely the cost of punishment is low, $2, right? So um, the I'm just going to sort of point that out. Lab experiments might have relatively high punishment, like 2 out of 10. but absolutely low. It's $2, right? So it might be a large proportional punishment, which agrees with the theory, but if it's a low absolute cost, that's not a great test. And again, like I was saying, in real life, punishment might open the door to retribution and feuds and greater costs. Um, so revenge, punishment of the punishers, is rarely an option in these lab experiments, but in the real world, it's a real risk. So there are lots of examples of feuds that last for decades, extend over generations. Think Romeo and Juliet. Um, and in there, examples in non-industrial societies where feuds lead to splitting of groups, in the Yanomamo, in the Amazon and Kalahari societies in Southern Africa. Right, so feuds can be a real problem. So one experiment tried to increase the stakes, not to like blood feuds, but make um, the the actual monetary payoffs pretty high. So they played this game with high stakes of 1 to 3 months wages, or normal, more like the earlier published versions of the ultimatum game, where it was more like a day's salary, or less. And what was interesting was that, sorry, this wasn't the ultimatum game. This is the wage game. The employer-employee agree on amount of work and then provide a certain amount of effort afterwards. And it actually didn't really matter when you played with high stakes. So actually 1 to 3 months of wage was being offered and either paid for with effort or just taken without. You still got a similar relationship. The higher the offered wage, the greater the actually expended effort. And that was for high stakes or small monetary amount being offered in this game. So that was kind of cool. Then there have also been studies of what are called LPA, late Pleistocene appropriate societies. And what's interesting is there are examples of severe punishment, even death, but they're not usually tied to free rider infractions. In other words, um, uh, acting selfishly at a cost to the group. So, although some of them might be depending on sort of the belief system of the society. So free rider interactions include theft and cheating in the context of meat sharing, and maybe it's not clear what the betrayal of the group to outsiders. So the other infractions are not necessarily, sort of free rider, like not paying your way. So some of them are, many of them are not. Punishment is, frequently observed and reported, although not necessarily so much tied to sort of selfishness in the context of like group behavior. So that's one study by Bohm in 2012. Um, Interestingly, Bohm also sort of reports a lot of sort of cultural practices that seem designed to reduce the costs of punishment, the risks of punishment. In other words, there are ways to carry out punishment that that seem designed to reduce the likelihood of revenge or a feud. The two of them include where you have the entire group enforcing it, so not an individual that so if an individual is punishing someone else, that means that only one person is vulnerable to a retributive revenge attack. But if the entire society comes together to enforce a free rider infraction, that should lead to acceptance of that punishment and not lead to like a blood feud. And then another mechanism to reduce the risk of punishment is when you delegate the kin of the person who did the infraction to enforce the punishment. So you make a family member um, or admonish um, the free rider. So one example that was in the readings was in Richardson Boyd was of Sefu, who in the Hadza tribe, who they hunt cooperatively, sort of as a group, and they're sort of working through the forest to encircle and maintain their position. Um, and but Sefu stole game. In other words, basically he killed and took for himself a prey rather than maintaining the circle that was going to basically herd and then capture multiple prey animals. So when you do that, the others can escape from where you were supposed to be. And so in this example, Sefu was disciplined by many in the group, not by an individual, not by members of just a single family. And Sefu's family stepped away from him as the game that he'd hunted was confiscated. And so that also, including the family in that punishment and their acceptance of it, made it less likely that it was going to lead to like a feud between any families in the group. However, when Sefu's game was confiscated, it was distributed to the group. So the punishers are being rewarded. So in this case, it doesn't appear that the punishment is costly to those group members, although it is going to be enforcing cooperative behavior. And so in this case, the punishment doesn't appear to be that costly, but it will enforce cooperative behavior among all the members of the group. So there's back and forth and more studies to try to see whether people are willing to punish even when that punishment might be costly. So the fact that in one study punishment didn't appear to be costly doesn't mean that individuals are unwilling to punish when there is a cost. So the some of the issues that get raised include that one, you might after the system has been worked out and is functioning sort of stably, that sort of equilibrium or stable functioning has probably reduced the costs of punishment that were present at an earlier time or would be present if the society isn't working that well. And then the other sort of, response is that it's possible that the societies that get studied now as late Pleistocene appropriate may or may not have the ability um, to govern and regulate themselves within the larger, nation state that they belong to, which is an interesting situation. Um, not going to talk about that more. It's some interesting examples though. Okay, um, so I want to, kind of just end by reinforcing the differences between strong reciprocity, as Richardson and Boyd are talking about it, versus reciprocal altruism, as Dawkins is talking about it. Reciprocal altruism, you're talking about either being helpful or stopping being helpful because the other was not being helpful to you, right? And so that can work if you have many, many repeated interactions with the same individuals. And then the other thing is that the punishment is not that severe, just not having someone else help you later. That could be important, like in the vampire bats, you could die if someone else doesn't feed you later. But in other cases, it might not be that severe a punishment, just refusing to cooperate. Strong reciprocity, the punishment could be much more severe than the defection. In other words, someone steals some game and they might risk death for that robbery. The punishment could be much more severe than the benefit of acting selfishly, right? So the range is really different. Um, and then the other thing is that the reciprocity might be more vulnerable to invasion by defectors, whereas punishment can be quite a bit more stable. Strong reciprocity maintains altruistic traits within groups, maintaining both differences among groups and the heritability within a variance in behavior. So basically, that enforcement of social norms makes everyone in the group, forces everyone in the group to behave the same, and also can maintain that behavior over generations. That would be the heritability. Another interesting important point is that strong reciprocity works in large groups and and works with non-relatives. Like it works, strong reciprocity can work in a group of 30, it can work in a group of 500 or 1,000, although you might have to develop things like, tribunals or courts or even police to enforce strong reciprocity. Kin selection doesn't scale up because, I mean, if you're an ant or a bee, kin selection can work on a large size because one individual can lay 50,000 eggs. But in other size groups, kin selection is limited by the sizes of the families. And reciprocal altruism depends on small groups in order to get favors returned and repeated interactions. So it's only going to work in small groups. So strong reciprocity can work on large population scales. Kin selection and reciprocal altruism can't. They can only work on small populations. Um, and then the last point that Richardson and Boyd are making is that if you have this cultural transmission, enforcement of social norms, now you have an environment that favors altruistic traits. In other words, individuals that are constantly being punished, having their games stolen, having their materials stolen, being ostracized or shunned or maybe kicked out of groups, that is going to lead to lower genetic fitness, lower average reproductive success. So societies that are enforcing cooperative behavior should favor genes that avoid punishment, that behave altruistically, right? And so the genetic traits that lead to altruistic behavior are, you know, innate predispositions to feel guilty when you've done badly, um, to feel that like justice is an important thing, that like when you see something going on that's unfair, that bothers you and that you're willing to intervene, and also to understand the interests of others, to be able to empathize. Like those are parts of human nature, along with selfishness and desire for prestige and desire for like reproductive success. All those things are part of human nature too, but so is guilt, so is the sense that like when you see something bad, it or someone cheating someone else, it bothers you. That's there's no like law that says that we should be feeling that way. The fact that we do feel that way is partly shaped by our culture, and cultures vary in like what their sense of justice is and what they see as an infraction. But there's also probably a gene culture coevolution that's been going on. Okay, I am that actually sort of ends the lecture. What I'd like us to do is I only post because I'm a bad person. I only posted the reading yesterday, so that's not good. What I would like you to do is, if you haven't had time, I want you to read the Matthew and Boyd article and come back in, let's say, 20 minutes. I'm going to post a worksheet. We're going to split up into groups, and we're going to discuss it. So Matthew and Boyd, 2011. I'm going to post the worksheet now if you want to take a look at it. But in 20 minutes, we're going to come back. I'm going to split the survivors into groups, and you should be working together on the worksheet, because some of the questions um, are pretty straightforward, and the last one is a little bit harder. Okay.